Yes, we've moved it over here, so well done. That's super. Come and join us at the front. Daniel, I was going to say don't sit too far back, but with you I think actually maybe you should sit right at the back because you'll ask me very difficult questions. Yes. Okay, this is your last and final boarding call. The doors are about to close. No, they're not really. But if you do want for the question time, just come up in this front segment and we'll make a start. Hasn't been the shortest service in the world, and we want to go home for some lunch at some point. Yes, come up higher. Come up higher. Sit next to Daniel. He'll keep you out of any mischief. Ooh. Okay, we'll make a start now that we've got our little gathering here. So there are two ways you can ask questions. You can put your hand up and ask a question that way, or you can click on the QR code and go to Slido if you want to put an anonymous question in it, or it doesn't have to be anonymous, but it gives you the possibility of anonymity if you do it that way. Oh, they're still coming. You're still coming. That's marvelous. Yes, come in, line up. Come up higher, or come a little bit nearer if you're coming for questions. That's great. Okay, so I've received several questions during the week. We are being live streamed again as a separate stream, so our conversation, just so you're aware of that. So your questions and anything I say will go on be available on the website afterwards as well. So we've had three questions during the week. And there's been a couple during the service today, and I will come to those. I think maybe I'll start with those, because several of them are anonymous, so I'm not sure if those people are here. But let me look at those questions, and then if anybody wants to come back on those or ask other questions, then we've got the microphone here. So the first question was put on, actually, last week, from somebody who gave their name as The Slippery Slope is Real, which is an interesting name. And in fact, even before we get to the question, it's an interesting name. I was just saying to Fiona before, the slippery slope argument that, in other words, that you pass permissive legislation that's initially quite restricted and then it gradually becomes more and more liberal, which is exactly what we've seen at the other end of life in terms of abortion, but also, and we'll explore this more in detail next week in the service, particularly what's happened in Canada is very striking. It was almost exactly the same time that the House of Commons here was voting against legalizing euthanasia. They were voting for it, and they have extended the criteria several times, even in the first decade. Anyway, that was just the name. The question was, is there a debate to be had between the sanctity of life and the quality of life? And I think what I'd say to that is we need to recognize they're both real. The sanctity of life is all or nothing. We are, for all the reasons I outlined in the sermon, absolutely made in the image of God, whatever our capacity or quality of life. But of course, quality of life is a real question. And I guess, not quite sure where the question's coming from, but I think the questions around quality of life would feed in perhaps to how much medical effort is put in to keeping someone alive. Again, next week we'll go through this in more detail, and I'll justify this. But my understanding from a Christian point of view is that there's all the difference in the world between intentionally taking life and choosing not to use every possible medical technique to keep a person alive. The former, I think, is always wrong. That's just a clear breaking of the commandment not to murder. The latter is a question of wisdom and negotiation with doctors and the application of a merciful view of the situation. Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, a very great 20th century preacher, refused his doctor's permission to continue treating him when he was at the very end of his life because he said, "You're keeping me from heaven." He knew that he was in the Lord's hands. He didn't want any more treatment, and I think that's okay. So, yes, there is a debate to be had there. Right, the second question. With the power of modern medicine and a worldview that this life is all there is, how can we make it possible for people to die graciously? Well, yes, and our conversation, Fiona, was very much that, and as you said in the interview, the arguments that we make will have to be ones that appeal to those without faith and who view things very differently. And that's okay. We can make pragmatic arguments as well as ones from biblical principle. We need to make both and probably lead with the pragmatic ones. But actually, the power of modern medicine is such that there is very little pain that cannot now be well controlled. And again, we'll look at this more next week, but I think one of the reasons under God that we've had the development of the modern hospice movement and palliative care has really come out of nowhere to being an extraordinary branch of medicine in the last 50 years has been because of Christian involvement, particularly people like Dame Cicely Saunders. So the ability of Christians to influence for profound good for all of their fellows, we've seen in the last half century. So even if we feel the secular forces are against us, it's worth looking to and honouring people who can make a profound difference as Christian believers, whether they're clinicians or parliamentarians. Anyway, so I think the power of modern medicine is key in that question. What is reasonable end-of-life care according to the Bible teaching? Well, I was reading in my quiet time this morning Paul's teaching to young Timothy, 1 Timothy 5, and he's telling Timothy how to relate to the members of the church. Treat older women as mothers, older men as fathers, younger women as sisters with absolute purity, younger men as brothers. In other words, we're family. So if we want to look at what reasonable end-of-life care is according to the Bible teaching, it's that quality of care that you would give to your own immediate family member is what we ought to be working towards and aspiring to for everyone in our society, even if they're without physical family who might otherwise be able to help them. So there we go. Those are the three questions that came last week. We've got three already on Slido, and you're voting for them, which is great. So these are all anonymous. Let's do these. Should we expect non-Christians to be living Christianly? To enforce Christian morality could be detrimental. How does this relate to issues of life and death? I think that's a really good question. And as a general rule, we, of course, as Christians, even if we wanted to, we wouldn't have much ability because of our numbers and our relative weakness in our current culture to impose our views on others. In the times in history when we have had the power to do that, I'm not convinced that was always a good or beneficial thing to do anyway. But what is certainly true, and this is where I think one of the things that I've warmed to, I think probably over the last 5 years, increasingly in terms of our witness, is that we need to know our history. We need to know, for instance, that it was the witness of the early church, not in campaigning for legislative change to outlaw abortion, but simply taking abandoned infants into Christian homes and caring for them, caring for the elderly, caring for the weak and the outcast, that in the end proved so compellingly attractive that it began to influence the whole of the Western tradition. And we could say similar things about our view of children, about all sorts of things. Our provision of medical care, much of which arose, of course, from Christian settings through the medieval period. So I think we want to lament less about the fact that we're no longer the culturally powerful force in our society. Reflect more on what God has done just through Christians being Christians which has been so much the story of the Western world, and recommit ourselves not to telling people what to do, but to serving them in a way that can bring radical transformation. So it's not about enforcing Christian morality, it's about serving the needy, and where we have opportunity to influence, of course, doing so not because we're trying to advance our religion, but because we actually care for people made in the image of God. And they're multiplying these questions. Right, how do you expect a non-believer to respect our Christian morals? Should the aim not to be to evangelize first? Well, ultimately, of course, that's our primary hope and prayer for every unbeliever that we meet or that we know, is that they come to know the Lord Jesus. Because otherwise, even if their life is extended for a few more years on earth, eternity will bring a different outcome. So the most loving thing we can ever do is to take the opportunities when the Lord creates them for us to share the gospel, that people may believe. I do think Jesus teaches us that non-believers will respect our Christian morals. Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, somebody will find me the phrase in a minute, I think it's about the end of about the middle of chapter 5, when you do your good works, people will see them and bring glory to your Father in heaven. Is it somewhere around Matthew 5:13 or somewhere? Somebody find a reference anyway. And Peter says something very similar in his first letter, that actually when the non-believing world looks in on us, and that's the challenge to us, to live out our faith, to live out love and commitment and concern for others, well, then actually they will come to respect that. They may not believe it. It may be a certain grudging respect, but actually they will see that, and it will make a difference. Third question. This is the third question on the latest one. So I want to one more after this, and then we'll come to questions from the audience. Can you please go over the theology behind the sanctity of life from conception highlighted onwards? I did rush over that a little bit, so apologies for that. But the testimony of the biblical authors, like David in Psalm 139, like Jeremiah in chapter 1, the consistent approach is to regard God as having given individual life from the moment of conception. And therefore, the idea that there's some identifiable period between conception and birth where we may say that this is a human person is just not a biblical view. It is a very ancient view. It's the view of the ancient Greek philosophical tradition, which did influence the church very much, particularly in the medieval period. But the biblical picture, and I think particularly we see this in terms of the miraculous conception of Christ, the emphasis is all on the conception. That's where God becomes flesh from that moment onwards. So happy to pursue that if anybody wants me to go further. Okay, and then the final one on here. The current end-of-life pathway withdraws food and liquids. Our family member suffered for 7 days. Why make them suffer further? That's an incredibly personal and painful experience that whoever's put this on, it's anonymous, has gone through. I think there are really difficult ethical problems about withdrawing food and liquid, and I would be very happy to hear from others who've got more experience or wisdom on that. It seems to me that's a different thing from withdrawing medical treatment. So somebody, for instance, on an artificial life support, I don't think it's necessarily wrong to turn that off and to allow nature to take its course. But the withdrawal of basic food and liquid seems to me a different thing. Equally, I know that is not straightforward. I remember when Sarah was a junior doctor in the geriatric ward, as it was still called then, and somebody would come in, a patient would come in from one of the care homes, and they were required by their protocols, even if the person was relatively near death, and if they couldn't eat, to put a feeding peg into the stomach. And then you create the ethical problem, because how do you then decide, having provided food and liquid that way, when you can withdraw it? So I think this is one of the many. I mean, there are so many difficult areas when we have to do the least worst thing. I think it's probably about as far as I want to go on that one for now. They're the questions that have come in. I'll keep an eye. But, thank you, Kevin. That's very helpful. If you can just go there. We'll probably lose the slide now. So there we go. If you want to switch it over, Ian. Let's go to Neil over here.
It's really interesting hearing you say about let nature take its course. Because, of course, if we didn't have modern medicine, then we would have 50% of children dying at the age of 2. And amongst adults, our life expectancy would be about 55 years.
Yes.
Yeah, you go back a couple of centuries on the foundation of the church, that would be the demographic reality.
I'm 55, Neil, so thank you for choosing that. Thank you for choosing that number.
And I'm just beyond median age, yeah. So the whole thing is a construct, well, maybe not the whole thing, but it's largely a construct of modern hygiene and modern medicine.
Yes.
And exactly as you said, you use treatments, and then the question is, when do you stop it?
Yeah.
So the whole thing is kind of hyper complicated by the fact that we can do so much, and yet we can't do everything.
Yes.
So how you navigate that very difficult line between intervention and non-intervention.
Yes.
And you said a moment ago, again at the start of what you were saying, that you wouldn't see withdrawal of a treatment as necessarily an ethical issue, but there are those who would. And you get into situations as well where families are divided about whether intervention should continue with a parent or not. So I think the whole thing isn't so much, for me personally, about euthanasia and non-euthanasia. It's about how we navigate this whole complicated nexus of interlocking issues. And just the euthanasia aspect is one very salient part of that, but it's only one amongst so many. So what do you think the church or the Christian community is doing in dealing with this in the broader sense of how do we deal with medicalization of old age, and how do we then manage to give a broader, Christ honoring narrative that helps people to navigate their way through this incredibly challenging phase of life?
Yeah, that's a really helpful question, Neil, and I agree with your analysis of it, and the complexity of it is significantly impacted precisely by the science that's developed at great speed over the last, over my lifetime, and over particularly around palliative care, as I was saying before. I would hold on to there still being a very clear distinction, both ethically and medically, between treatments that are designed to minimize pain or to have a curative effect to the underlying condition, and the decision to administer poisons to end life. So, for example, the typical, if you go to Dignitas, you'll get a massive dose of barbiturates with a drug to stop you throwing up, and the only intention of that medicine is to kill you. Whereas if you're on an NHS ward and you're in pain, then typically you'll have the morphine pump, and it may be that one of the effects of the administration of morphine is to shorten life. Although I've heard I've been listening to a number of things this week, 2 doctors say that actually the administration of morphine can then lengthen life because crippling pain shortens life as well. So even sometimes giving a dose of morphine that would be unwise in somebody otherwise reasonably expected to live a lot longer can have a life-lengthening effect. But the intention of those 2 pathways is I think, genuinely chalk and cheese. It's not to say that I disagree with you that there are a lot of grey areas as well, but I think there are some clear right and wrong things to do. And it comes down to intent, the intent to end life, or the intent to minimize pain, one side effect of which may be to shorten life. But the complexity that we've created, or that modern medicine has created, is absolutely right. Fiona, you were about to say something there, weren't you? Yes, come to your microphone.
If there are no more questions, just three reflections on
No,
working
please,
on this
please.
in Parliament. Firstly, on quality of life, I learned not to judge others' quality of life when I was working on this issue. It's very clear that there are people who, looking from the outside, you might consider have very major challenges. But our priority should be to do all we can to help them live life as well as possible, and not for them to feel threatened that their life is of less value. And I know that there are campaigners like Tanni Grey Thompson, who was the Paralympian. You might have seen her commenting on this year's Paralympic. Speaks very powerfully about this. So we just not judging others. So many people with what we might consider is not a great quality of life will say, I want to live. I don't want this bill to pass.
No,
secondly, on palliative care, the UK has the best palliative care in the world. And we need more public investment in it. And you'll find that people who are pro what we call assisted suicide, the bill calls it assisted dying, they'll say, oh, of course we do. Of course we do. We all agree on that. But actually we mustn't fall for that trap, because it's clear from accounts from other countries that once assisted suicide is passed, public funds are then utilised for the promotion of assisted suicide that would otherwise go to palliative care. And there are even some cases of people having been told they can get assisted suicide administered on the state, but they cannot get any public funds for palliative care. And that's the slope that we would go down, I'm sure, of less money going in to palliative care than ought to go into in the future. I think that the average, I could be quite wrong, but certainly some hospices get about 30% of their funding, public funding, for the care, and have to raise the rest. We need to shout loudly for that to be increased, and not for funds to be diverted. And then lastly, should we focus on evangelism as Christians? Well, I think that in Parliament, by focusing in a compassionate and courteous way on issues like this, was a great witness to other parliamentarians who don't have a faith. One of the things in Parliament that's respected is what I'd call a cohesive worldview. And the Christian worldview hangs together. And I noticed over the years that, as someone said, others might not agree with us, but Christian MPs were respected. And as much for the manner in which we worked as what we said, but addressing legislation like this, beginning and end of life, and like the persecution of those who are being tortured, whatever their beliefs, or developing world aid, is very powerful witness that Christians care. Is that helpful?
Really helpful. Thank you, Fiona. Yes, I'll just give that to Kevin. You only made 3 points. I made 8, so that's okay. You're allowed to do that. No, and I really appreciated what you said in the service as well. So, thank you, Fiona, for that. No. You've got your 4th point, Kevin. Bring the microphone back. Oh, sorry. That's right. Audrey will come to you in a sec. Yeah.
One always thinks of something in a debate that one should have said afterwards. Every debate, you get used to that. But of course, I bitterly regretted after you'd interviewed me of encouraging people to write quickly. You should, of course, wait until Mike's second sermon next week.
Yes, okay. Yes,
Sorry about that, Mike.
Thanks, Fiona. Just to reflect on one of your points, and then come to you, Audrey. I mentioned it before, but I do think, and in terms of our learning from history. One of the parallels, and I'm sure you've looked at this as well, the parallel between us and the Dutch experience, that actually over that similar time frame, it began to be decriminalised in the early 80s in Holland. Well, in the same time frame in Britain, we've developed a hospice movement, as you say, world-leading palliative care, and that hospice movement with Cicely Saunders and Christopher's and Mildmay, it was very much pioneered by Christians. So this is Christians in the modern secular world making an enormous difference in terms of caring for people at the end of life. And actually, if you look at the way those cultures have developed, Holland is very much now a culture of death, and the doctors bring death. We've never had that, at the end of life. Our doctor, that when you see your doctor, he or she is charged to care for your life. And that's what we're talking about. That's what's about to change. But I think we need to be encouraged by the fact that Christians have actually made a profound difference, even in the last few decades, around these issues. So we don't want to give up just yet. Audrey.
It's not really a question, but I was going to thank you, Fiona, for picking up about the public expenditure in hospice care, and we should increase that. But the other thing I just find very contradictory is a lot of people who support assisted dying talk about dignity in death, as if there is no dignity in a natural death. And if you talk to people who work in hospices, they tell you a different story. And again, what Fiona said about us judging another person's quality, dignity, etc. But my point is, in America, in the States where the death penalty is in force, a lot of the opponents to that cite that this is a barbaric, cruel way to take a person's life through lethal injection. And yet, on the other hand, we have people in this country saying that to die naturally, implying it can be undignified. Well, I suppose it can in some cases. And that to go to Dignitas in Switzerland, you will have a dignified death. I think, why don't the guys in America contact the guys in Switzerland and say, can you give us some of these drugs that you're using to give our guys a dignified death? It's just the argument, it doesn't hold to me.
No.
I don't, it's just a comment really, Mike.
No, and it's an interesting comment. I do remember back at that time when we had Anne Widdecombe 30 years ago, and one of the things that people really objected to was that she was an advocate for the pro-life, anti-euthanasia, but also pro-death penalty. And people felt that was incoherent. And on a surface level, I get that, although, of course, the Bible prescribes precisely in that verse I quoted from Genesis 9, prescribes the death penalty for those who murder. So there's an internal coherence to it from a biblical worldview. But it's really interesting, though, to hear that story about just the way the language is used, isn't it? And and even the whole language of assisted dying is a euphemism, isn't it? As you said, Fiona, the title of the bill has nothing to do with suicide or euthanasia in it, even though that's what we're so. And that's been the Euthanasia Society changed its name to Dignity in Dying a few years ago. So just as with the abortion debates, the shifting of language away from using negative words is very much part of winning the hearts of minds. Because who if you're slipping away from this world, who doesn't want to have kindness and assistance on your way out? But that's not the same as pumping me full of barbiturates to push me out. And that's what we're talking about. Okay, let's go to our next question. Andrew.
Sorry, I've just been prompted. Forgive me, you know how thick I am. The thing about what did he call it? Do not resuscitate. How does that fit into the view?
I think that plays into the same question that Neil and others have mentioned before, that just because we can do something doesn't mean that we necessarily should. So I think if a conscious, reasonable adult in sound mind that chooses to decline certain forms of treatment, then I think that's different to actively taking life. And we would draw the line in different places. Again, I was listening to a talk given by Professor John Wyatt, who I quoted in the. No, in fact, it wasn't. It was another. It was a much older man, a retired surgeon who served as a conservative minister in the John Major government. But and he was telling the story of somebody who'd had several heart attacks and was trying to insist that he be able to sign one of these do not resuscitate orders, and in a way that probably would be difficult to do now, the doctor said, no, I'm not doing it, and I'm going to keep bringing you back. And in fact, he went on to say, well, after that, he never had another heart attack, and the argument the doctor had used was that he was a solo dad with a 12-year-old son, and that he jolly well ought to fight for every opportunity to stay alive for the sake of his child. Well, as it happened, the doctor was right, and the man won. So these are not, again, none of this is simple, is it? So I think a person ought to have the right to say, I don't actually want you to treat me. You can't force me to have a treatment. But equally, perhaps we ought to be willing to persuade people sometimes that, no, you really are worth it. Don't give up. We're going to be here for you and support you. So I think there's a right, but also I think there's a moral case to make for persuading someone not to do a thing in certain circumstances. Joyce?
Yes, our family recently had experience of do not resuscitate. My mum's had one in place for a number of years. And it was refreshed each time she went into hospital. Yes. But it was her conscious decision.
Yeah.
And that was following a discussion with my sister-in-law's father, who had been resuscitated in an ambulance. Yeah. If it had been down to the family, we'd have said, oh no, you fight, Mum, you keep going.
Yes.
But she'd had a very sound discussion with this guy called Ron, who said he regretted the fact that they had been revived simply because he felt so awful physically awful afterwards. Yeah. And he wishes he'd made another choice. But the do not resuscitate forms, they could be misused.
Yes.
And I have heard cases of where they are. But generally, the patient is consulted, and it is a patient choice
yep.
about it.
And again, though, I'm not going to identify family members or congregation members, but I've been involved in a number of those discussions over the years around DNRs, and it can be difficult as well. So if the patient has advanced dementia, and therefore no opportunity to contribute their own view, but it still might be a loving decision not to physically keep that person, or artificially keep that person alive. And I've certainly been involved in those decisions. But I mean, they're never easy, and you're trying to make the best choice you can, aren't you? And I think that's a biblically informed mind and a loving heart really is all we can bring to those decisions.
I've got the mic.
I was just looking around for it. Angie's got the microphone. Go for it.
I wasn't in for the sermon, so I've got no questions really. But I've got comments about what Fiona said and just the DNRs. I've got somebody at the moment who has one and has had one since she had a major heart attack last year.
Yeah. And
every time she's gone into hospital, it's gone in with her. She's now in a home, and it's in the home, so we're both happy with that. I was shocked to hear that funding would potentially go to assisted suicide rather than palliative care. I also work for St Luke's Hospice locally, and unless it's changed, they only got 15% of their funding from the government, so we have to raise 85%.
Yeah.
That's awful. And then I'll end with a miracle, because my friend's sister had a heart attack, and then within 48 hours, which I know is common, had another one. And they said she was brain dead, and she had kidney and liver damage. Yeah. She was quite an active person, and they said, I don't think she'll be very active, so she was on her life support, obviously. She stopped breathing wherever she collapsed. And they must have seen something, one would assume, on the scan to say she's brain damaged. And today we're going to take the machine off. So her husband said, please can I have another day, which is quite an emotional thing. So they took the machine off the next day. She started breathing. she's out of hospital, she has a pacemaker, she has no kidney or liver damage. And I'm thinking, either they're totally incompetent or that's a miracle.
Yeah.
My friend's a Christian, but the rest of her family aren't.
Yeah.
And she keeps saying, oh, it's been a miracle, it's been a miracle. So they were actually discussing the hymns for the funeral and making arrangements in the hospital because the doctors were so, this is not going to work. And she's out and about doing her thing.
Wonderful.
So that's good news.
Well, we're going to, presume it was a miracle rather than medical incompetence, because that's kinder. But yes, thank you, Angie. Any more? Go on, Fiona.
Very quickly again, sorry to
No.
speak again. This highlights a point made time and time again, including my doctors, that they simply can't always get it right about terminal illness.
No, absolutely.
And that's a real danger of
and the
this
prognosis particularly is
Absolutely.
often wrong, isn't it? Yes, thank you. Yeah. Which is why an Act of Parliament that specifies that time in it is basing it on a very insecure foundation.
I think too it's this weakness in the whole situation when the goalposts are moved, because it's people who are in difficult situations like disabled, or they're a burden and the burden gets to be too much. There's so many places where that person can be made to feel.
Yes.
And I know of one or two cases in the village, a district nurse, and she was just explaining how this elderly person gets pushed nicely and all that sort of thing. But it's just a big thing then, isn't it, that people suddenly then feel not wanted. And so this business of loving people and the caring is part of the love. There is a reward in that. I don't mean, but so many people that having cared for them.
Yes.
It can be a special time, but I know that doesn't. If I say sell it, you'll forgive me, won't you? But at the same time, it's very much a relevant point that this could escalate. How do we contain it in the moving of it? And
and I think your point about care is really important. Because one of the in our culture, the idol of the age is freedom. To do what I want to do when I want to do it. It's my right, it's my autonomy. And of course the reality is, in the world that as God has designed it, that's a lie. We come into the world utterly dependent on the mother and the wider family that's brought us into the world. We then go through a season of life when other people are dependent on us. We have kids and we look after elderly parents. We then go to the end of life when we're once again dependent on others. And God's designed us to be that way. So he's designed us in a world where actually we're meant to be dependent on each other. We're meant to care for each other. We're not, heroic, independent creatures. No man is an island thing. So, that, and we'll talk about that next week.
Older people now are very much saying it's their life. We want them to live.
Yes.
It's their life. They're entitled to a life, and I don't want to be a burden.
Well, that's that phrase, isn't it?
Yes,
you're meant to be a burden.
Yes, and yes,
you're a burden
right.
to your parents when you come into the world, and you're a burden at the other end of life to your children, and in the middle you look after both ends. That's life by God's design. It's not a mistake.
I'm trying to give my children the reward.
You what? Sorry.
By being a burden. To make sure they get properly rewarded and being a burden.
No, you're fulfilling your role. Well done. Yes.
Hi. Really, I think somebody said this morning about a family resolution can be found before somebody, if they had this assisted dying, then it wouldn't happen. But for our family, my dad died quite a few years ago, but it was me and my sister actually cared for him, and it was such a joy. In those last weeks of life, we laughed and we had so many nice times. And that would all go away, wouldn't it, if you didn't have that?
It would.
And the beautiful thing was my mum and dad divorced when they were younger, when we were young. And they didn't speak for 40-odd years.
Gosh, yeah.
On his deathbed, my mum said, would you like to see me? And she came, and it was just a joy, and that wouldn't happen again.
No.
That family resolution and that gave us such peace. You know,
absolutely.
that's
Well, and that's the thing about suicide as well. Suicide always makes the family feel guilty.
Yes.
And I mean, I've done so many suicide funerals over the years, and it's always a feature. Because you always feel, you know, should have done more, or should have, you know, spotted it or whatever. But it'll be the same at the end of life. You know, even though they might say, well, it's my wish, we don't want to be a burden. You're going to feel the guilt of that. So we're going to create a whole raft of guilt. Well, would that more people would, call their minister in when they're dying. But some of those seasons has been the most privileged moments of my life, and seeing, you know, I've seen people reconciled on their deathbed, and I've seen people confess burdens that have been with them throughout their lives that they confess, and that's, and it's a healing. It can be very often a healing. I mean, I won't say names in this church, but you know the people who've died well in recent years, and we've seen that, and it's a magnificent witness, isn't it? That brings a life well lived to an honourable close, that helps those in that life to let go in a way that doesn't have guilt and regret. And when we kill the person, or they choose to kill themselves, none of that can happen. Well, maybe I should confess that actually most of what I've taught you this morning is based on what I teach every year to GCSE and A-level students, but modified for a Sunday morning. So we're doing our best, some of us. Go on, Fiona. Everyone's going to be gone soon.
Quick comment that...
we're going to let this be the last word.
Last word.
No pressure.
I believe that us in Parliament defeating that bill nearly 10 years ago actually saved potentially thousands of lives for eternity.
Yes.
Because people had that time, not just to reconcile with the family, but also with God.
The Lord, yeah. Absolutely. No, thank you, Fiona. It's a sobering, but also a wonderful note on which to end. Let me just pray, and we'll finish for today. Father, thank you for helping us to think through these deep and painful things. We're conscious, Lord, that we don't have all the answers, but we know that you do. We know that your word is true. We know that your grace is real and transforming. And so we pray for your help as we continue to wrestle and witness and to write our letters to the MP, to be engaged practically in caring in our own family and our own community. Lord, please would you help us here at St. John's to be the light on the hill, the salt in the decaying society, as you have commanded us to be. We ask that, Lord, for your great glory. Amen. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, thank you, Mike.
There you go. I'll probably say it every time because I forget things. When you're 55, and then life's nearly over. Thanks, Neil.